Okay, here's the The House Has Passed is collected poems from 78 to 98, 20 years of production. And it marks both an end and a beginning, because 1998 is the year that I went to Italy for 2 years, and so it's a transition period for me. And probably the best place to start would be at the end, because it is a transition. And in the end, the last poem is entitled Postscript. Feet up, 37,000 feet up, in the air of winter, barely leading a Canadian front, on Ash Wednesday, with only return the real thought inescapable, to where thousands of feet up again the weather waits and the weight of flight continues, to make insomnia a thing of the past. Merely jet-lagged, is slightly tired, language changes in the transition from state to state to state the obvious, but I mean that language even changes on the way from mind to mouth, slowed down and slurred, feet up, to get the blood flowing again, down to my head in full circulation, no longer a way out, walking against direction, in fuselage, against leaving to return, and return as leaving. That walking against direction and fuselage is a line that was in my mind for years. It's a line that I used to think about as a kid. And when we took the plane, because we flew to Vancouver when we left Italy, I was thinking how I could walk down along the plane in the opposite direction that the plane was going to avoid reaching the destination. Finally I got to use it in a poem. So 20 years of working in a language that's borrowed and changed and put together, stitched to other languages, and in order to try and make sense of something. I'm not sure what that something is. But I guess when you look back on it, something must be said in all these words. I don't know. Postscript is a part of that series. It's the last series of poems in the book. And male diction, because I feel that males have a language of their own that hits up against their maleness, and in a lot of ways that the inability to escape that diction is a malediction, because it keeps us from communicating. And I really started thinking about that male diction when my daughter was born, and how I would attempt to communicate to her certain things with outside of the influence of my maleness. Terra Mara is obviously dedicated to her. Her name is Mara, so Terra Mara, and also the play on words of Terra Amara. And all these poems, looking back again after 20 years, it's a history not only of myself, but it's really a history of the family. It's a history of the people that I met during these 20 years. It's a history of my history with Antonio D'Alfonso and Guernica, because I started publishing with Antonio. So it really represents it traces out that line that goes from 1984, when I first, 83, 84, when I first met Antonio and the other Italian Canadians in Rome, and establishing a sort of relationship and going through all the evolution with the association and the struggles within the association and the fights and the struggles and the attempt to not only write in poetry but also in essays, try to get a grasp of this situation that we're living. And it's all reflected in this. It becomes a journal of my 20 years before and after the association. All of the writing is experimental in the sense that I'm always looking for a form, and I find that in composing any type, even one short poem, I have the ideas, I might have the subject matter and the themes and the metaphors and all that stuff, but before I actually write it, it's the form that really dictates when I begin to write. It's a process of finding a form, and the book reflects that. And each segment that's represented in here represents a period in which I found it necessary to find a form different from the last. And so whether it's dictated by readings, interests in whatever medium, film, photography, because visual arts are very influential in my writing. I like them, I use them, I absorb them, and regurgitate them through my writing. They all necessitate a different format. And so it's an experimental notebook, The House Is Past, of the stages in my life where I've approached different aspects of culture and tried to absorb them and then represent them in my own words. All through the filter of language, which continues to be a challenge. Coming face to face with a foreign language like English, trying to make it mine, trying to maintain my Italian, trying to maintain my dialect. Then with children, you begin to hear how language is acquired, and that becomes interesting. All the combinations of words that, especially for them working through two languages, Italian and English. So I love words that my children came up with, and I try to insert those in some, like instead of luna or moon, it's muna. Instead of fish and pesce, it's pish. And those are fantastic. I use one in one poem that's instead of nightmare, Juliana says night mirror, which is a good reflection of what we do with dreams and images. So male diction is a type of circling back to one's consciousness and awareness of a cultural imposition, cultural conditioning. Tenamada is an attempt to reconstitute something for my children through some rituals, and I insert those in the poems, some rituals associated to southern Italy. And approaches to absence, now we're working backwards through the chronology of this. Approaches to absence, I guess, is recounting of my work in language and in culture. And I think most people that see approaches to absence read it in the opposite sense of what I mean. I don't mean that a silencing or an erasure of myself, or an assimilation in that sense. It's an absence in the sense that I'm trying to obscure the mechanisms that make my writing or my language different. Trying to make absent the mechanism, trying to make it natural, which of course only seems natural to me because I'm writing it, and it still appears stilted and odd to someone else who's reading it. But hopefully I'm having an influence on how people are reading this work, and so when they approach my reading, they become absorbed into it and hopefully accept that this is a different language. So that absence is, I'm posing the language as something to stand behind and appreciate. There's a spiritual angle to that book that maybe makes a more direct connection than everything else can flow through. Mm-hmm. And that spirituality, I don't want to call it religion because I don't want to refer to any organized religion like Catholicism, because obviously it's influenced somewhat by that, and you can see it if you read it. Mm-hmm. But it's spirituality because that also came at the time when, after Mara was born, so the first child, and there's again a reassessment of positions, of meaning of one's life. From that Approaches to Absence, just a short poem, Nothing Can Be Done, which I think explains this transition of languages and this exciting new way of looking at things. And lately, my hands have become ears for a strange movement, hardly audible speech of epidermal waves. That the child in the belly that shows these waves of presence. They're just amazing to see that and touching that. There's connection with another world and with yourself at the same time. And then before that, there's a small book that I published with Jawbone Press in Los Angeles, The Posthumous Poet, which was a series of poems that was, I guess, inspired by spending a summer at the Pasolini Archive in Rome, where I got to go through all his papers and see all his films and all the outtakes. It's an amazing experience. The material in there is fantastic, and just an incredible archive, photographs, film, everything. And after spending a summer there reading and viewing films, these poems developed. I was attempting to work on a book on Pasolini, which didn't work out. I eventually used that material to write some articles on Pasolini, but that experience really manifested itself in a different type of book, not a critical book, but a book of poetry. What his work really represented for me. I don't know what to say, just a fantastic individual with an incredible influence that I think has yet to be discovered in Italy, understood the impact that he had on Italian culture. And then before that we go back to Nomadic Trajectory, which again, I think that was really a transition book for me, because it represents, really encapsulates a lot of the linguistic and compositional experimentation that I was trying before, and that defined itself and made it possible to go on and write other books. One I think is much more full of emotion, the Pasolini one, while Nomadic Trajectory is full of a different type of maybe subterranean emotion, because it needed to get out certain forms that would give me freedom, and that's the compositional aspects of Nomadic Trajectory do that. It's a very odd, compositionally, it's a very odd book. I chose the image of the desert and the nomad because I felt like I needed to establish some virtual territory and space in which I could move. I had done things with the language. The form had always been important. I went back later and did more things with the language and form, but I needed to define my own space within English and within poetic form, and I tried to do it in those poems. I'm still not sure if those were successful or not, because of course they didn't get reviewed very much, but maybe, maybe you can zero in on these forms. And these are the forms. I was trying to break the verses up to give a sense of movement point to point. You move either down or across to read, but in whichever way you go, you always come up to, and you have to face the space that's in between the verses or between the sections, and then every once in a while you hit upon these little pieces that block the way, and so I was trying to work my way through language and form in that sense. After having done this, I became more comfortable with, not more comfortable, but I defined the form for myself more clearly. It really helped to go through this. I didn't know at the time if it would work, and as I said, it's still not clear, but I needed to define a territory, and I think through a lot of that book I was defining territory. For example, there's a poem, Branta Canadensis, which is about borders. I had just moved to Los Angeles and then to San Diego, and I was near the Mexican border, and all of a sudden the border shifted for me. I was once again a sort of immigrant, but before I was close to the US border by being in Vancouver, then I shifted down 1,700 miles to be near another border. And everything became more virtual and more undecided and more schematic as to where I was and who I was and what I should relate to. And in fact, for my first 2 or 3, 4 years in California, I feel like I went through an identity crisis. I was trying to define myself. I really didn't know if I was American, Canadian, or Italian. And at the same time, I was attracted to Mexico, which was a great way for me to define a new culture. Finding Mexico and the desert in California was of paramount importance for my being able to stay there and feel comfortable there and resolve that identity issue and realize that I was nothing. And then Partenope also is part of that series of poems, which is a step back, and it's a composition about Naples and the different dimensions that you find in Naples, which is the pre-Greek, the Greek, the Roman, and then the contemporary post-Roman period, and everything else that comes with it, with the various foreign invasions and governments. And so there's that layering in Naples itself, which is my native city, that also makes it impossible to really state your identity one way or another. You can't say I'm Neapolitan and mean anything specific, because the influences are just too many. How do you go back and find who you are? We have Arabic, we have Moorish, we have Greek, we have all those mixed up together. And the culture that exists now is a result of all those. So I brought all those elements together, the indecision, the undecided identity of my shift down to another border, and going back and reassessing what Naples, Napoli could mean. And as I say in the poem, this is not a tautology. There is no direct correspondence between any of them. They're all transition states. And that's where I found myself at that time. So yeah, form-wise, composition-wise, thematics in the book are transition state that broke then into posthumous and approaches, actually. More approaches than posthumous, because posthumous took a different direction. Before nomadic trajectory is another collection. This is an odd collection too. This is Isthmus, which I also published with somebody else in Los Angeles, Literal Press. It was just after my move to San Diego, and this probably is a preview of the forms that I used in Nomadic Trajectory. Isthmus is the book that I feel less satisfied by because it's an in-between book. I had started that work in Ipsissima Verba, which to me is a very strong book in the sense that the statements that I make in the language and the form have been very important for me throughout, and because it came after a more narrative book, which is Moving Landscape. So Ipsissima, which was a little 16-page pamphlet that I published myself through parentheses writing series, really was a switch. Ipsissima, it was a click, and you're working in a new mode. And then Isthmus, that's why Isthmus feels sort of odd. The more direct jump is from Ipsissima to Nomadic, but there were some things that were happening in my life and at that point that needed to emerge through Isthmus, which is a piece of land that connects a peninsula or a piece of land to an island, or another small piece of land in the sea. So it's a narrow piece of land. So I was looking for something. I needed to cross from one place to another. And Isthmus represents that. Isthmus goes back to my work, my education as a biologist. It has to do with the ocean, with the sea, the isotherms, which are where layers of different types of water define themselves in the ocean, because you have one mass of water that's one temperature or salinity, and another mass just underneath it that's another temperature or salinity, and the isotherm is the thin line where the two meet. And the isthmus is that thin line where one piece of land meets another piece of land. And I was trying to meet myself somewhere. I was trying to find that layer for myself. And that's why it's an odd book. And I found this great image by Clemente from this series of etchings entitled Il Viaggiatore Napoletano, which is two people whose hands are joined, almost become one arm without hands. And that to me also reflected that image of the isthmus, or conjoining, and giving the uncertainty of where one body begins and the other one ends. The isthmus is, let's see, 91. Nomadic trajectory is 90. So there are gaps in there. There are gaps of a few years, from 85 to 90, 5 years. And I don't know if you can talk about poetry books as necessary or not, but maybe Isthmus wasn't necessary as a book, but it was necessary as a writing. I was looking for something. It didn't make sense. It just didn't make sense to me to be with anything else. It was just too strange. Yeah, I think possibly, not even Ittissima Verba, I don't think would have fit with Nomadic Trajectory, because aside from using the form as a way to help me, as the last thing, I always think of these poems, even though they might be small and individual, I think of them as a block. I'm always working in not a theme, but issues that define themselves in a block, and so to put them together, I mean, it seems odd now that they're all together in one book, but they have to come out individually, because that's what I was going through at the time, and it didn't make sense to me at that time to put them together. And Moving Landscape, what can I say about Moving Landscape? It's taken me a long time to feel comfortable with Moving Landscape.
Why?
Because they're early things, and I just wasn't sure about myself as a writer, I guess. Though I love the work in it, if I can be arrogant. And it represents a lot of movement and a lot of traveling. A lot of them were written in Spain, in Mexico, in Italy, in Holland. All those poems are really collected from my moving around so much. And so they're very important, because that movement formed me, because it enabled me to read outside of what was available to me through the little Italian, as far as books that I could get in Vancouver, and the very well defined and squared off Canadian culture that I was able to meet in Vancouver. Vancouver at that time was very isolated. It's much more cosmopolitan now, but at that time it was incredibly isolated. And what existed as culture was very well defined. There was not going outside any limits. My first inkling, outside of the travel and my first inkling that there was something else happening in Canada was when I went to the Western Front on, I don't think it's Hastings, but the street just below Hastings, maybe it's Powell. And I went to the Western Front bookstore, and I saw a book by Guernica there, and I saw an Italian name on a book of poetry in English. It was Filippo Salvatore. Something clicked there, and so I started to chase that down to see what that was all about. And that's what Moving Landscape eventually came out of, that meeting of these other people. My experience as a writer up to that point in Vancouver and then in Victoria didn't feel like it had an out. The workshops, I took workshops at the University of Victoria while I was studying there. Actually, I'd finished already, and I was working in the library, and I took workshops with Robin Skelton and P.K. Page. They were both great because they're just people with incredible knowledge of literature and writing. But I always felt like there were 10 people in the class and someone else that was me looking in, because I could never find a connection with the other writers, and often I couldn't find a connection with the people who were leading the workshop. So Moving Landscape represents that period of not having connections, trying to find connections, eventually seeing that something outside existed and attempting to make that leap outside of Vancouver to somewhere else. If I go back even further to think about when I first started writing in English especially, I wrote a sonnet copying Leopardi when my uncle died, when one of my uncles died way back. And then in English I started writing using puns, using my biology class, writing about tapeworms. And that stuff came from John Lennon, from having read his writings. And there was a book of his drawings and writings that came out. And I started copying that because that seemed to me a way to undermine the language and play with the language to get some results that were unconventional and would communicate something that I wanted to say. The possibility of taking the language and twisting it. The Italian stuff, I mean, little thoughts and things that I had. I had a diary when I was 9 years old that somebody gave me, and I started writing in that diary, and I would write little thoughts of that. I still have that, yeah, but yeah, nothing special. No, but I've always enjoyed words, and I've always enjoyed language and the challenge of communication, either as a possibility or to undermine communication.
Thank you, Pasquale.
Thank you. Welcome to Montreal.